Hi, everyone. My name is Alan Jacques. I'm an industry thought leader with Kinaxis. I focus on the life sciences industry, and it is absolutely my pleasure today to welcome an old friend, Hussain Mooraj, to talk about cell and gene therapy. I've known Hussain for probably almost 20 years. Um, During that time, I have aged, he has not. But Hussain is currently the practice lead for Next Generation, or what they call Next Gen, and he's also a chief futurist. And Hussain actually founded the Next Gen practice at Deloitte. And Hussain, just want to start off with a very quick question. In 2009, Pharma Voice voted you as one of the 100 most inspiring and influential people in life sciences. What number do you think you're at now?
Well, that's a great question, Alan, and I'm still not sure why they voted me as the
Okay.
top 100 back then, right? All I can say is I have the good fortune of working with such uber smart people around me from a client perspective, from all the people I get to work with, and that I'm continuously learning and growing. And to me, I meet somebody on the top 100 in my mind, at least on a daily basis, which just
Mhm.
pushes me further.
Yeah, great. And I can't remember the last time I've seen you. It was either at my place for dinner or smoking a hookah, but it's been a while. And I'm looking forward to reconnecting. I wish this was in
Likewise,
person.
likewise, smoking that shisha is a great idea. Let's
It is.
look forward to it.
Okay, so Hussein, cell and gene therapy. I've been in the supply chain industry for all of my career, pretty much, in big pharmas, medium sized, small. I've never managed a cell and gene therapy product. I've never managed a launch or anything like that. I understand the science, but could you talk about cell and gene therapy? It's not like just one entity. It's actually a bit diverse. Maybe explain to the group, like me, what the different subverticals are and what we need to be thinking about with each of those subverticals.
Yeah. So, you know, I'll give you my short history of being in the cell and gene therapy side. And Alan, you know my background. I've been on the manufacturing side from a chemical and textile manufacturing perspective. I've set up and run manufacturing networks, and then been in the supply chain and enterprise technology side for 20 plus years after that. Most of that is in life sciences, but cross industries. But I really came across cell and gene therapy about, back in 2016 when one of my clients called me up and said, "Hey, my he was the chief operating officer of a startup at that time, and he said, my people tell me that you're somebody that we can trust, and we are in hot soup because we are trying to implement a digital platform to take our CAR T product um, commercial." And I was just like, I have no idea about cell and gene therapy. And you know what his response was? He was like, good, because if you told me you knew this space, I would have closed the phone. Because nobody at that time really knew how to launch these products. Everything was on the bleeding edge. So we dove, rolled up our sleeves, and for 2 years I sort of dove straight in and helped launch that product. And by and large, and thus we founded and started the dedicated practice for cell and gene therapy and synthetic biology at Deloitte 5 years ago now. And we kind of categorize this into a couple of areas. So the first one is cell therapy, which is cells and tissues are cultured, they expanded, and then implanted into the patient. And there are two flavors to note. One is autologous cell therapies, where you use the patient's own cells that are modified outside their body and then reintroduced into the patient. And then you've got allogeneic cell therapies, where these cells are isolated from a healthy donor, Examples are mesoblast stem cell, for instance, right? And then you've got gene therapies, and that's where a gene of interest is inserted into a patient, and this can be either in vivo or ex vivo. And ex vivo gene therapies are the classic CAR Ts, such as Kite's Carta, Novartis's Kymriah, or Janssen's Carvykti. And then the in vivo gene therapies, where the gene of interest is directly injected into the patient through like a viral vector. I mean, an example of that is Sparks, Roche's Luxturna, for instance, for genetic blindness. So that's how we kind of categorize it.
Okay, thanks. So, if I'm not mistaken, the first CAR T product was launched in 2015. That was Novartis,
Kymriah.
if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Yep.
So, what's the landscape look like now? I guess there are at least 24 products now that are being commercialized somewhere in the world.
You know, this market has just massively grown in the last few years. So back in just in 2019, there were 27 cell and gene therapy products that were launched worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
And if you count the one that was launched this morning, it was Alnylam's RNAi
Yeah,
product.
I saw that. Yeah.
It's the total count in 2022, and we just halfway through the year, is 89.
Oh, wow.
And there are over 3,000 cell and gene therapies in development as of December last year,
Okay.
which is just incredible. And to give you a viewpoint on this one, the FDA came out a couple of years ago and basically said that we predict that by 2025 there'll be 10 to 25 products launched on a yearly basis just in cell and gene therapy, because they've got hundreds of INDs coming in every year,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
much more so than even if you combine all of small molecule and large molecule.
Right.
So it's a burgeoning space. There's been a tremendous amount of investment in this area. About 100 companies a year have just been going public in the cell and gene therapy space for the last 3 years, and many more in the private space with venture capital money behind them.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like what we lived through in the 80s and 90s with biotech. I mean, that was the beginning, and processes were not very mature, but then it just blew up in, like late 90s and 2000s.
Very much so. And you could even follow the classic monoclonal antibody kind of
Mm-hmm.
journey when I recall, and you recall for sure, right? And we used to talk about this when the MOABs first came out. We were like, wow, these are expensive,
Mm-hmm.
right? And same thing with cell and gene therapy. You've got therapies going for $500,000 all the way through $2.1 million,
Mm-hmm.
as is the case with Zolgensma, for instance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then over time, as production scale, manufacturing scale came into play, as a lot of the kinks were ironed out, as guidance came out from the regulatory agencies to be able to know what to do in certain situations, the overall cost of the COGS for monoclonal antibodies, for example, declined considerably.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
the medications became a lot more affordable. Likewise, we expect this to happen with cell and gene therapy as well, where COGS can be as high as 60 or 80% sometimes in this space.
Mm-hmm.
But we just don't know when, right? A lot of it depends on manufacturing breakthroughs, scientific breakthroughs, we do know that there is a tremendous amount of capital that's going into this area, not just from an innovation standpoint, but also what we would call the picks and shovel space, such as CDMOs and CDMO
Mm-hmm.
capabilities,
Mm-hmm.
cell lines, iPSC cell lines, for instance, or gene editing capabilities, etc. So all the peripheral stuff around this is being heavily invested in as well.
Okay, so Hussein, let's focus a little bit on autologous CAR T. So when you're looking at an autologous supply chain, value chain, and let's say I'm coming from big pharma or from big biotech, how do I need to think differently about this supply chain?
Yeah, that's a great question, Adam. So I always say that traditional pharma supply chains or biotech supply chains are all built around the product.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got the raw materials that are purchased, the product is then manufactured, it's then pushed out into the supply chain, and then the product is taken in the supply chain into the market where the commercial organization then pushes the product into the clinician, the hospital, direct to the patient sometimes, etc. In cell and gene therapy, everything is built around the patient. It is clinically connected and has to be really digitally integrated, much more so than in traditional pharma and biotech. And it's pull based. So the rhythm and tempo of the supply chain is very, very different. It's a classic example of made to order,
Mm-hmm.
where the patient cells must be collected at an apheresis site, shipped to a manufacturing site, and then are modified into the therapy or the drug product. Then these cells, these modified cells, must be shipped back to the hospital, typically in a cryo state, minus 140 degrees
Mm-hmm.
Celsius, right? And then infused back into the patient. And the patient itself is the bioreactor in certain cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
Without the
Mm-hmm.
patient, the drug wouldn't exist. And the manufacturers can't just store these cells, in a warehouse somewhere. You are also, um, you know, from a plan perspective, you have very short lead times. This is a personalized product, so
Yep.
there's no safety stock.
Mm-hmm.
You've got limited availability of raw materials. You're creating and you're manufacturing one batch per patient.
Mm-hmm.
And typically, when you gather the apheresis material, you only have, if you screw up for in the first time around, and perhaps it's not viable, there aren't enough cells per kilogram, for instance, out of the batch that was produced, you only have one more chance left in many cases where you've
Mm-hmm.
got what's called a one restart that's available. And the parameters that you are releasing the product in are very narrow. All of this is a new process, so there's limited guidance from the regulatory authorities. And oh, by the way, there is no finished good safety stock to fall back on.
Yeah.
And most importantly, in certain cases, you are dealing with a high degree of exceptions to the value chain itself. And
Mm-hmm.
I know your next question is going to be what kind of exceptions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these are very sick third line patients sometimes you're dealing with. So sometimes the patient was too sick to come in from an infusion perspective. You've got a 2 to 4 hour window which you've got to schedule the product into the hospital and you only have a certain number of handoffs, certified handoffs you can do, or God forbid the patient dies, or there's an issue with your cryo supply chain, for instance. So
Hmm.
there's a level of complexity due to the ecosystem that you've put together that doesn't exist in traditional pharma
Yeah,
products.
yeah. So if I were to kind of rephrase it, you're tackling two issues. You're tackling the vein to vein tracking and physical movement and modification of the cells. Um, and failure, you have a life imbalance, so there's no room for failure. And then you have the supply chain management of a supply chain that's, as you said, characterized by 50% exceptions. So I can imagine those exceptions are hitting you multiple times per day. You have to be able to run scenarios, run simulations, do what ifs, and make decisions on capacity, on patient numbers, or as things change. There's no plan, there's no fixed horizon other than maybe 5 minutes, and that's the kind of capability you need. So you need rock solid, I would say tracking distribution capabilities, and then you need very nimble planning capabilities to be able to manage weeks out, months out.
Brilliantly said. Absolutely. Now, let me add another level of complexity to what you just outlined so succinctly, Alan. You heard me talk about the complex and frequent touch points among the supply chain, the commercial, the patients, the clinicians, in which we have to plan together as an ecosystem, right? And those traditional barriers which exist in enterprises today have to be absolutely broken down. That's why I
Hmm.
actually don't use just supply chain here. It's all about the value chain.
Hmm.
And I was talking to an executive at a top 10 healthcare company who recently, launched a CAR T product, and he said something really interesting. He said he used to head manufacturing the platform on the small molecule side, and he said that in his old job, you never saw the patient,
Hmm.
right? Here, in his new job, from a CAR T perspective, you have multiple interactions with the patient. In the
Yep.
old job, he'd barely meet with a commercial organization once a quarter. And here in the world of cell and gene therapy, he has daily interactions with the commercial organization, the regulatory organization, development, the clinicians, etc. So it's a very different paradigm in which you have to plan in.
Yeah. If I could throw in a few words from my side that might resonate. So, concurrent planning, breaking down walls, transparency across the supply chain. Everybody sees immediate impact of any event. Hussain, we're almost out of time, but I did want to ask you a really important question, maybe the most important one. Could you share with the audience, especially any members of our audience who are getting into this cell and gene or in the beginning stages, what are some of the lessons learned that you would want to share with them?
You know, Alan, that's a phenomenal question, right? And I've had the privilege and the honor, and it's a at least a life achievement for me personally to be leading a practice that has helped launch many and most of the cell and gene therapies out there in some way, shape, or form. And some of the key lessons learned have been that you've got to, when you design the value chains for these products, you've got to call the failures out fast. So you've got to fail
Mhm.
really fast, and especially around innovation.
Mhm.
Don't wait until you're too close to the commercial launch to be able to say, okay, this particular technology or solution does not work, or this design we should, you know, try not to leverage the existing capabilities we have, but just build new capabilities. Call out
Mhm.
those issues fast, right? You've got to also then innovate outside your four walls.
Mhm.
You've got to develop an ecosystem with which you collaborate and commercialize the therapy. And you've got to, we all talk about developing strategic partnerships, but in reality, most of these partnerships in the past have been at arm's length within life sciences
Yep.
organizations and the ecosystem. Here, you truly have to have strategic partnerships. Invest in talent. I would say that is probably my third piece of advice, where you've got to not just hire, but you've got to retain key scientific, technical, functional talent.
Mhm.
In just the practice that I run, for instance, what gives our clients the outcomes is when you bring in deep science
Yep.
with strong functional capabilities, such as life supply chain execution, for instance, strongly underpinned by digital capabilities. The three of these have to really go hand in hand in cell and gene therapy piece of it. I think the last one I would say is um, think about your operating models, right? So many organizations start by trying to launch cell and gene therapies within their existing operating
Mhm.
model, and it doesn't work. And we've seen this story play out too many times now. And you've got to think about maybe adopting some sort of a nerve center concept to support the evolution of traditional capabilities for cell and gene therapy, and nimble decision making, right? Because you've got to bring the science, the technology, the functional aspects really in a
Mhm.
nimble manner, bring them together. And to be able to do that, you need some sort of a nerve center, if not a dedicated, focused capability and operating model to do that.
Great. Hussein, unfortunately, we're out of time. I would love to continue this conversation a lot longer. But thank you so much for joining us. And I would encourage anyone who's listening to Hussein and myself to reach out to either or both of us if you have any questions. And Hussein, I'm looking forward to, for the first time in history, you buying me a beer. Thank you.
Cheers. This has been fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you.